If I have a belief that people are friendly and I'm walking down the street and someone smiles at me, I would be like, oh, nice, people are being friendly.
Yeah.
Now, if I have a belief that people are out to get me, someone smiles at me, I'll be like, oh, they're making fun of me.
You can never separate what you experience in life from the beliefs that you hold. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the hypnotic loop, a 4-step feedback loop that dictates every single experience that you have in life.
Yeah. You can go to the same bar and you can be like, wow, people here are so friendly. And then someone else may be in the same bar, in the same place, thinking people here are so unfriendly.
The physiology that you carry yourself with, and even how you store experiences in your memory to create a future function of how you will behave. Using this episode, you can create a positive experience out of any moment of life so you can stay more grounded, more stoic, and be more effective as you move through the world. I hope you enjoy this episode and see you on the other side.
Welcome to the Data Driven Actualization podcast. This is Ege.
This is Numer.
With Dr. Numer. And today we're here with a new format. Dr. Numer is going to ask some questions around things he's been curious to learn more about. I have no idea what the questions are, and we'll just see how this conversation unfolds.
All right, excited.
All right, what are the questions?
Yeah, so this one comes from our discussion at the Turkish restaurant, actually, where kind of the punchline you said was, well, it doesn't matter precisely what's true. It's about which assumption is most conducive to your experience. And in many ways, that was quite a paradigm shifting way of looking at it for me, because, you know, as a scientist by training, it's always like, what is the truth? And so it almost felt very backwards of, well, we're not putting the truth first, we're putting the assumption first. But then obviously the more I went and played around with it, the more I saw how powerful it was. But creating, I guess, a coherent model of knowledge around it was something I figured we'd chat about. And to create that coherent model of knowledge, I'll start with some, I guess, very basic, cheeky questions first, and then we can kind of explore the nuance once we ground our discussion more rigorously.
Okay.
And so going back to this idea of, the reason this also was interesting to me was, I think a big thing in self-development is like, choose your own reality, bring people into your reality. That other saying of, I'll believe it and then I'll see it. Hashtag manifest.
That's right.
And so we have all of that. But then, you know, the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, there is such a thing as truth, in that if I'm about to throw a punch at someone and they don't move, they are getting punched.
Right.
And so that was kind of the first thought that came up was, well, they're getting punched regardless. So how does what assumption they choose even play a role in what their reality is? So if you could kind of help ground the discussion and clarify what exactly we're talking about in what context, I think that would really help.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, for everything we experience, right, there's a story that comes with the experience. And I think like every moment of life is subject to what's known as the hypnotic loop, which is a concept that also comes from James Tripp, who's like a hypnotist and does internal work. Now, I don't really use it as much anymore for day-to-day coaching, but it's really useful in terms of understanding how nothing is separate from the story that you tell yourself. And the hypnotic loop has 4 components, right? The first component is the belief that you hold. So whatever is happening, what do you believe about this experience? So even with the example of a punch, right? Okay, it doesn't change, and it's a silly example. But it doesn't change that someone's going to get punched, but it might change how much that punch will actually hurt.
Yeah.
Based on the belief that someone holds. So the belief is the first component, and that's the component that can be difficult to change by yourself if you don't have an understanding of the three classes of shadow of like, okay, there's interjections, which are beliefs I take on from the outside world and believe about myself. There's projections, which is something that's an internal disturbance that I shoot out into the outside world. And then there's split ego states, which is a confusion and a conflict between different parts of yourself. So you want this, but you believe this. And that creates a sense of almost dysregulation.
Yeah, and just to clarify, when you say hurt, it just isn't about the physics of it. It's also like
right.
A fighter can take a punch and just think, this is just another punch, versus making the biggest, like, he punched me. So you're not just talking about the physical part, you're also talking about the emotional feelings.
Right.
And I guess the full story about the punch, right?
Yeah. And even in a physical sense, right? There's been examples of people who were caught up in emergency situations who could lift a car, which is crazy, right?
Yeah.
Physically, you're not supposed to be able to do something like that, but just because of the adrenaline and almost a level of desperation of saving someone that they really cared about, in that moment, that became possible.
Yeah.
And I think those are the examples from which we can see that every reality we want to live in, it's a reality that exists somewhere. It may not be the reality we're a part of now, but it is a reality that can happen. And I think actually one of the cool examples of this is, I don't know if you've seen this show I think it's on Apple TV, Dark Matter. Have you seen it?
No.
So I was actually watching Ted Lasso, and then I was done with that. Nice. And then I saw this show, and the whole concept is around like this guy is a physicist, and he discovers a mechanism through which you can go through portals and go into different realities.
Yeah.
So what happens is in the first episode, someone from a different reality himself actually kidnaps him and sends him into like this corridor with different realities, because he, who comes from the different world, realizes that he wanted to actually stay with his wife and not be in the reality that he was a part of, right?
Yeah.
So the whole concept of is this guy going between different possibilities that could have happened in his life, and every door that opens is a different reality for him.
Right.
And I think in a sense that concept holds true for most people, and then we kind of default into a reality based on the choices that we make.
Yeah. And I guess, let me see if I'm getting this right. There are all the different realities, and it's easy to look at it a lot more mechanically to say, I need to do X, Y, Z to switch between realities, which is partially true, but it's almost like really people think reality comes first and then beliefs are second, but it's almost the beliefs come first, and then that's what creates the reality. Because if you believe it's an emergency situation, your reality around your strength is very different.
Right.
Versus if we were to think reality comes first and these things are fixed, then that's not what we're observing in the real world, right? Given this relative we see based on the beliefs.
Yeah. So belief is really the foundation, and then from the belief, there comes the physiology, right?
Yeah.
So if I walk into a room and I have lots of belief in who I am and what I can offer to the people, the way I walk into the room is different versus someone who believes like, oh, I'm not important, I don't feel enough, and all these people don't want to speak to me. And I think that's an important part as well. So belief, you can almost imagine like an arrow from the belief to the physiology.
A lovely little flowchart with a feedback loop, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the physiology also affects the experience that you have. So for example,
could we talk about physiology a bit more?
Yeah, sure. What do you want to know?
So what exactly would the physiology be around someone? Because in many ways, the physiology is a very tangible thing, right? So for someone who has positive beliefs around bringing conviction, that they're valued, that they're doing something good, how would their physiology be different than someone who really doesn't want to be there, thinks they're a nuisance to the world, and can't wait to leave, how would their physiology or in your experience coaching, how does it look different?
Yeah, so if someone has a lot of self-belief, there's a few signs we can pay attention to. And I think a lot of people try to change the signs without changing the belief. And that's when there's this feeling that they're being inauthentic or they're overcompensating.
Or it all falls apart the moment there's a bit of pressure applied.
Yeah, exactly. But some signs are, open body language, taking up space is a big one. Looking at people in the eye, not extensively, that's the only thing you're focusing on. But, not just looking into the floor the whole time and making eye contact.
Vocal tonality as well.
Vocal tonality. Actually, it comes down to, the 5 foundations we used to talk about back when I was doing a lot more social coaching, which was vocal tonality, the way you speak. And actually, a funny example of that is I was catching up with a friend like 2 weeks ago, right? And I sent him a voice note, and he goes, "Dude, what type of voice training have you been doing? Like, your voice sounds so much deeper."
Yeah.
And I thought, I'm not doing any voice training. I've just been doing like shadow work.
Yeah.
And the thing is, a lot of the time, you have these different energy centers, right? So one of them is in the throat. And if you have a sensorial belief that you hold on in your chest and your throat, that usually affects your voice. So when you let go of that belief, usually your voice changes.
Yeah.
So that's when the belief feeds into this physiology again.
Yeah.
And if we just try to fix the physiology, sure, you can sound very loud and very confident when you're trying and paying attention, but that's going to get exhausting.
Yeah.
So vocal tonality,
and to, I guess, be very concrete about it, it's not that it happens in a mysterious way necessarily. It's also something as simple as you've let go of the belief and now you feel a lot more lightness around the muscles in your throat, so then you can express more, as opposed to being like some mysterious abstract shift that we're not sharing.
The process itself is simple, right? But again, like, could I go on ChatGPT and say, okay, how do you make brain surgery? And I'll read the instructions and I'll go, okay, this makes sense. But to actually do it,
how does numeric dance bachata? Well, sure, there's an instruction, but
that's right,
that hasn't been translating too well.
It's been getting better. It's been getting better. So, in that sense, it's simple, but to implement it can also be tricky. And I think going back to the physiology, there's vocal tonality, there's eye contact, there is space, how much space you take, but also how you use your space. And again, we're not talking about overcompensation here,
the lack man.
Right. Like, if you're in a crowded metro and an old lady is trying to sit next to you, you don't need to be like, "Hey, old lady, I'm pretty alpha here, so you can't sit." That's not who we want to be, right? But who we want to be is someone who can take up space, but also have enough awareness of his environment to be flexible. So a big part of this is not clinging on to the physiology itself. Because then you're exhibiting the right behavior, but you're completely missing the point of working on physiology. It's kind of like people who do anything to get six-pack abs, right? The point is to be healthy. But eventually they put themselves in a position where their body is not healthy anymore. But they have the look that they want. It's very similar to that. So that is the physiology component. Did you have any more questions?
What were the final two? One was openness, body language, and then the final one was proximity.
So space,
vocal
tonality. Proximity is another one. That's more in a dating context, right? You don't want to be too far away from a girl you're talking to.
Don't want to be in your boss's face either.
That's right. Unless you enjoy that. There's the proximity element, and then
touch was the final one.
I think touch is a big one. And again, we're not talking about touching your friends inappropriately here, but we are talking about being comfortable, basically, again, owning your space, right? And at the same time, you don't want to be the guy with a super firm handshake just to
Just
intimidate.
breaking everyone's hand. Yeah.
Like I've met people like that where I was like, dude, that was completely unnecessary.
Yeah.
Right. So it's about finding the middle path, and also knowing the more you let go of unproductive beliefs, the easier it will be to kind of communicate the right physiology.
Yeah, exactly. It almost solves the problem at a higher level.
Yeah.
As opposed to trying to keep 10 things in mind about, is factor one working well, and then the moment life gets challenging, all those 5 different things fly out of the window. So that's very clear on physiology. And now could you talk about how belief and physiology shape our experience? Because again, from a very mechanistic worldview, it's very easy to think experience out there, fixed laws at play, ergo whatever the observer is doesn't matter because something out there is just happening. And I think that can also often lead to the questions of, was this person engaged or not, or was this person interested or not? And that can lead to these torturous loops for a lot of people,
right,
myself included. Versus how do beliefs and physiology change our experience of the situation?
Yeah, I think a good thing to understand is, based on the belief, you have a different physiology, and then from the physiology you have the different experience. So a very simple example is, if you have very open body language, you're smiling at people, you're being warm, you're being inviting, most likely when you go into a social setting, people will want to talk to you more. Versus if you're being closed off, you're not even smiling, you're looking at the floor, right? So then the experience you have in this social situation is very different. You can go to the same bar and you can be like, wow, people here are so friendly. And then someone else may be in the same bar, in the same place, thinking people here are so unfriendly. And that all comes down to beliefs and the physiology that you exhibit, right? And funny enough, we've had examples of people who visited places that we had been to before, and we thought, this place is amazing, people are so friendly, they're so warm, would love to go back. And they would go there and they would be like, man, the social life here just is really bad.
And I think this step is super interesting, because I guess we talked about it from, I guess, our actions going into the experience and shaping them, which is very valuable, because I realized that a lot of times the coldness that I was projecting onto someone else, I was like, wait, I was the one who was actually not standing them like this, waiting for them to go for the hug, when I was just looking at them with a resting Slavic face. And then I was like, why is the person being cold? And in that moment, I was like, wait, I was the one who was cold. And if anything, they were so warm that they were willing to go for the hug in spite of all of that. And so from the aspect of what we put into an experience and how that changes it, what you said makes a lot of sense. But then I think the other cool part was almost like receiving an experience or looking back at an experience that can also feel very different based on our physiology and assumptions. And I think of it very similarly to, you can give me a data set and the numbers of that data set are fixed, but then I can change the assumptions and then arrive at very different answers often. And so the reason I find this relevant is, a lot of times social settings don't always have very clear-cut answers.
Right.
And so because there's so much ambiguity left to interpretation, I find having the right mindsets, or not mindsets, but assumptions and beliefs about the world is very important. So could you, I guess, tell us more about how our beliefs, even just receiving the experience, can drastically change our interpretation of it?
Yeah, so for example, if I have a belief that people are friendly, and I'm walking down the street and someone smiles at me, I would be like, oh, nice, people are being friendly.
Yeah.
Now, if I have a belief that people are out to get me, someone smiles at me, I'll be like, oh, they're making fun of me.
Yeah.
Or they don't respect me.
Yeah.
Or, is something off with my look, or there's something going on in my t-shirt. And that's just a momentary experience, right? So imagine compounding that for 24 hours a day in your sleep,
Yeah.
and then compounding it 24 hours a day for 365 days in a year, and then compounding that for 20, 30 years. Those small moments can create a very different experience of life.
Yeah.
And I think it's not necessarily about zooming out and trying to see the difference, like, wow, this makes such a big difference in this moment. But it's actually about zooming in and seeing the small difference that this belief makes versus this other belief. How do I extrapolate that?
Yeah.
And what's the reality that creates? And one of the crazy things, especially with the internal work coaching I've been doing and we've been doing one-on-one, is sometimes when people let go of a belief, they remember the same memory.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, actually, my family did love me.
Yeah.
Actually, my family had so much care for me.
Yeah.
Actually, when I went through this breakup, I had so many people who were there for me. I actually wasn't alone. So they see the same experience that was in the past from a completely different lens.
Yeah.
Because now the belief is different. And I think in that sense, understanding this gives us the power to shape our past by shaping the present. Because the past is just a visualization that we agree on, right? That's why we sometimes have disagreements. Like, I could be like, oh, no, didn't we go to this place 2 years ago and we had this food? And you're like, oh, no, actually, I thought we had this.
Yeah.
And we actually don't know.
Yeah.
Like, who's right?
I think that part of we don't know also plays such a key role.
Yeah.
Because if everything was already written in stone and perfectly recallable, then the lens through which we look at it may matter less. But because there's so much ambiguity and there's so much variability, and almost the state of the system changes based on the lens through which you look, that's why I find this even more important. And I think that was a part that I missed for the longest time, was the behavior of the system actually will change in response to the lens through which you look at it. So not only it's not just a trivial task of reframing something and feeling better just for the sake of feeling better, but it actually very tangibly changes outcomes as well, was what I kind of realized the more I played around with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a very good example is what we just had like a few seconds ago, where we heard someone drilling in the background, and we could have chosen that as a reason to go, oh man, we don't know if they're going to keep drilling. How much background noise is that going to be? Is this going to destroy this conversation? And we could go into that state of being, right? And we could say, oh, let's just end this podcast, do it a different day. But now that we have the different belief of seeing, okay, let's just see how this goes, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we'll record the podcast. Those parts will be a little bit hard to hear. But, I've been listening to conversations from Fritz Perls, who is the founder of, or, one of the pioneers of Gestalt therapy, right? These audios are from 50, 60 years ago. And me and my friend joke that whoever is able to sit through them has the gift of learning the thing, right? Because they're so hard to sit through, and it's like cracky sounds in the background. So I can hold that belief and go, look, this is actually, at least in my perspective, really good content so far. And the people who find this valuable will probably sit through that, and we don't even know if it's going to continue or not. And that belief creates a completely different physiology, which creates a different experience for you, for me, and for the person watching.
Yeah, and I think the more I played around with this as well, the more it's interesting, because we're getting to a point where we're almost auditing our own cognition.
Right.
And, I thought about this from the perspective of my athletic career of, well, will actually going into a match believing you can win, is that a good idea? doesn't, like, it's not a very controversial statement to say,
Right.
yes, good idea. Do I believe that if I just believe I can win no matter what, that I'll win against the world number one? No. But in situations where there's ambiguity, like realistic matches that I have to play, it's way more useful for me to believe that I'm going to win or I have a fighting chance, and way less useful for me to believe that no matter what, I'm doomed to lose.
Yeah.
And that's what I found was really interesting, was I was like, yeah, obviously I'd want to believe that in the context of a match. But then the moment it comes up to doing that in domains that actually like maybe challenge us more, or we haven't been told that we were gifted at growing up, it's very interesting to see how that same cognition with the same logic often almost breaks down in other domains, or how different that logic feels while applying it there.
Yeah, and that's one of the things about building a breath practice, right? So breath is really about taking an area of your life where you do have a winning strategy, like what you had with your athletic career, of, okay, in this context, I can believe this, and then seeing how can I carry that to different contexts.
Yeah.
And what's the difference, right? How is it different that I can believe this in my athletic career, but not believe it in this area?
Yeah.
And actually making that connection between, seeing the similarities to eventually decide, oh, I can carry that feeling and that belief into my social life, into my financial life, into my business as well.
Yeah.
And we can do that with emotions too, right? So for example, you may feel a lot of love and compassion for a friend or for a family member, but then maybe you see a random person on the street and you're like, I don't really care about this person. So you can deconstruct the boundary of when someone becomes just a random person.
Yeah.
So would you care about a friend of a friend?
Yeah.
Or would you care about, maybe someone you watched on YouTube who taught you a lot of stuff that was a stranger, but it's not a stranger anymore?
Yeah.
And you expand that emotional state to all of these different people. And as a result of that, you're able to feel the same emotion for more people.
Yeah.
Which, again, it's a very good way to be, but outside of that, it makes you very grounded and stoic.
Yeah.
So even if you're a guy who just wants to achieve stuff, it has more utility for you to be that way. So when a stranger is doing something you don't necessarily agree with, like taking a corner without seeing if pedestrians are coming by and almost crashing into you and Dr. Numer, I'm definitely not talking about a personal situation. You can be like, it's all good. We're still alive.
Yeah. And I think that kind of way of deconstructing things was also one of my ways, I guess, when I wanted to be a little annoying and like really win arguments. When someone would throw a number at me of, if it's more than 25, that is this, and I'd be like, well, why do you choose 25? Why not 24? Why not 26? And then really deconstructing things would help see sometimes the arbitrariness of a lot of the boundaries we assume are set in stone.
Right.
Okay, so far we have the belief that affects the physiology and that affects the experience. What's the final component?
Yeah, so the final component, I actually forgot until 2 minutes ago.
Okay.
And then I was like, that's good timing. Thank you, mind. The final component is imagination.
Right.
So when we talk about imagination, before we go into any situation, right, we have some ideas, like unless you're really trained in your presence of how a situation is going to go.
Yeah.
So an easy example of this back in the day, again, when I was coaching more social stuff, one of the teachings was before you speak to a girl you like, just imagine this is like someone you have genuine love and care for. So imagine this person almost as someone you met in the past.
Yeah.
But you don't just send love to them, you imagine this person sending love to you as well.
Yeah.
And that creates such a warmer state when you say hello. And when I was learning this, it was one of the biggest difference makers that no one really talked about. People always wanted to be the bad boy.
Things,
the bad boy who was super flirty and said crazy things because that's what got the most attention on YouTube. But what actually worked was being this warm person who felt really good to be around. So that's that's an example of using imagination, of imagining this person as someone you knew in the past who had a lot of love for you and you had a lot of love for them, to bring up that warmth to then change your physiology. Where maybe before you were feeling more anxious, but now you're feeling a lot more open. Because now it's not a stranger anymore. It's almost someone that you knew, which then creates a different experience. And then when you approach that way, this person might be a lot more warm to
it's
you.
like just increases the probability that someone will reciprocate with warmth. And so
that then ends up in a different belief in a long enough
and
time
then
horizon.
It stabilizes into I guess that state that's created by the imagination can stabilize into a belief if you repeat it enough, would you say?
Yeah, and also these states are never binary, right? So even if that belief is stable in me, if I want to play around with it, I can still bring up that imagination.
Imagine everyone's as friendly as Colombians.
That's right.
Yeah, which I think reminds me of times when we were stuck in cities that we didn't want to be in. I think we played around with that, where we believed like every person we met was someone we would genuinely enjoy spending time with.
Right. Or for you, all girls were blonde.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's cool that this forms a feedback loop. And I think with imagination, in some sense, I find imagination can be the easiest to play around with. Because even if you struggle to imagine something, I think a phrase Jim Quick taught me was, if you can't imagine it, imagine you can imagine it. And that would like really help.
Imaginception.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess looking at this from a practical lens, what I realized was, okay, for sport, it was a no-brainer believing, or after a few experiences, believing that I would win was a belief that I could hold. And recently, the way I'll hold a productive belief is like, I'll choose it as an object of meditation. And then when doubt comes up, I'll 6R the doubt. And then that's how I'll...
So for people who don't know, what's 6Ring? Pop quiz.
Yeah, pop quiz. Yeah, so 6R is this process that I guess you taught me, and then you were taught by...
Yeah, a mentor of mine, Pierre.
And so it's a 6-step process that first says recognizing that a hindrance has come up, or recognizing that the doubt has come up, and then releasing the doubt, which the visual I was kind of given was, imagine the doubt as a ball that's held in your hand, and then release it, just letting go of the ball. And then relax is when you relax your mind. And again, the visual that I was given was, you can let go of the ball, but you still have a bit of tension in your hand. So you just fully relax that. And then you go, what is it? Recognize, release, relax. Then you re-smile. So then you put a smile on in your mind, in your eyes, on your lips, and in your heart. And then you return to your object of meditation. And then the final R, it's always, I guess, an interesting one, because to me it doesn't feel like the final R, but it's just repeat, which is like, fair enough. For the sake of...
Maybe they just like the number 6.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm not going to write them up on any technicalities.
Right.
But that's how I'll hold beliefs. But it was very interesting to see how in certain avenues of my life, it was like, okay, let me just believe this. But then in other avenues of my life, I'd be like, let me hold this belief. And in that very moment, a huge voice would kind of come and just almost trample the ability to hold that belief. And I feel like maybe other people can also relate to this. And so was curious kind of if you could break down this idea, I guess, specifically along the lines of, we want to hold the belief, but then this voice comes up. But then for some reason, we give more weight to that voice. And then we somehow assume that is true. But given, I guess, everything we've talked about, beliefs and reality, could you explain to us one what is that voice, but two, how is that voice not as why is that voice as real or as fake as also holding the belief?
Yeah, I think a lot of those voices come from certain beliefs that we pick up throughout our life, whether it's from our family, whether it's from our culture, it's from society, it's from content that we watch, it's from creators that we listen to.
Yeah.
And that's why I think a big thing to do here is really cleaning up your life.
Yeah.
And cleaning up your, like, what's entering your awareness and what's entering your mind, right? And one of the funny examples of this was I was watching a lot of Alex Hormozi around a year ago, and I think he has really good business advice. Now, on the other hand, because he is someone who believes in the linearity of time and who's really about building something super big, there's a lot of urgency in his voice.
Yeah.
And what I realized was my life started having a lot more urgency, although that's not what I really wanted. So I think first, the simplest way to allow that voice to slow down a bit more is to audit your content and the way you live your life. That's why even on a meditation retreat, what do, right? For 10 days, you go somewhere else, you don't check your phone,
Yeah.
you wake up, you meditate, you listen to a Dhamma talk, you eat, and that's it. And that really allows the mind to become more still.
Yeah.
And that actually shows you that the default was never the critic to begin with.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if it was, it would only get louder.
Yeah.
But it doesn't.
Yeah.
Right? And I think the second part of that is understanding. It's kind of like the more you listen to a song, the easier it becomes to remember. But most people don't recognize that this is a song they've been listening to for so long.
Yeah.
But it's still separate from who they are.
Yeah.
So I think we can shift the concept of who we are to this new voice, right?
Yeah.
And that's the idea
But
of
it takes a lot of kind of checking in and
right.
or exploring and cementing of the newer belief.
Yeah, it's similar to, when I was 225 pounds or 102 kilograms and I was losing weight, I was at the beginning going to the gym for 3 hours. I would go to the gym, do the bike, lift some weights, and then swim for an hour. So if you looked at my day-to-day routine, I was someone who was serious about his health in that day-to-day routine. But my body didn't reflect that because I had so many years of not being serious about my health.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with beliefs. Every moment you choose that new belief, you are someone who's believing that new thing more. But your default may not catch up to that at the beginning.
Yeah.
That's why at the beginning, there will be some effort involved in terms of how you shift this belief. And I think maybe another conversation, we can talk about how to make that more fun so it's easier to stick to. But for now, I think the idea is understanding that shifting that belief to your default is possible for everyone. Right?
Yeah.
But not everyone's able to do it because they're not dedicated to the practice. And there will be some force and choice involved, especially at the beginning.
Yeah. And I think that's where meditation really helps, because when you see the transitory nature of thought, you can almost start to see, well, the critic arises, but then the critic will fade away as well.
Right.
And then there will be some random time slot in the day where you feel really good about something.
Yeah.
And then once you start seeing how they're not as cemented, then I think the critic starts to lose a lot more hold over your mind, because you see that it's not actually your mind, it just fades away. And so when you talk about choosing beliefs, what concretely do you mean by that? Like, do you mean almost imagine the belief is like a set of glasses you've put on, and now try and spend some time exploring your world through that belief? Like, when we talk about choosing beliefs to cement them, what does that look like on a practical level?
Yeah, I think it's about exploring, like you said, what does a different perspective here look like?
Yeah.
And we're all, based on the level of development, we're able to do that, right?
Yeah.
So at a more concrete level, we can imagine how it's like to be a kid.
Yeah.
Or some people, if they're a little bit more open-minded, they'll I don't know if you've ever done this as a kid, but you might wonder, oh, what if I was a squirrel, or what if I was a cat?
What if I could fly?
Yeah, what if I could fly? That's a big one, right? So we're able to perspective shift, and we can do that not just at a concrete level, but also at a subtle level with our thoughts.
Yeah.
So I can go, what if I believed that people around me were super friendly? And you can really be a scientist about it, right? Don't just take the belief and say, this must be true because I heard it in a podcast. Go test it out for a week. But then a very important part is at the beginning, you want to pay attention to the small things that feel different, and not just be one of those people who are like,
did I get the 100%
I believe this, I believe this for one day, and I still don't have 100 friends yet, right? So pay attention to the small things. That could be as simple as, oh, someone actually smiled to me in the bus today. That didn't happen before. Or I had a random conversation today. That never happened before. So extrapolate the small differences that you see. And I think for many people, that's about like really writing them down and noting that down and taking what's happening in their mind to something they can actually see.
Yeah.
And actually taking the time to look back on all the good things. So that's, I'd say, one thing at the beginning. Over time, if you have deeper or internal beliefs that are rooted deeper, it's actually about removing those beliefs rather than trying to pick a different one.
Yeah.
But this is kind of just like the trailer, right?
Yeah.
You watch the trailer, you see if it works for you, then you decide if you want to go through the full process.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly how I think of it as well, is this is almost, it gives you the taste of how flexible we actually are. Mm-hmm. Because I think in some sense, once you know how flexible we actually are, the journey becomes very joyful, enjoyable, and almost easier. Mm-hmm. But really getting that first breakthrough to realize how flexible we actually are, that's where I think a lot of the drop-off happens.
Yeah.
And I think the other cool thing about looking at the little wins is that it sets you up for the big wins, because when you look at the little wins, you can then look at the bigger task at hand and be like, oh, I actually have accomplished 25% of this or 50% of this.
Yeah.
That means I'm so much closer to the bigger task. Versus I've seen, and I'm guilty of this myself, so no judgment, but it's easy for people to go, oh, I only did 25%, therefore I'm never going to get to the big task. Versus you can have the same you can have a healthier set of beliefs and look at the 25% as the reason you're going to accomplish the big task.
Right.
And that sets you up for so much more success as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Any other questions around this?
No, I think that's all for now.
Cool. Thank you guys for watching. Put that to use. And yeah, what would you say is one tangible thing people can play with after listening to this conversation?
Keeping the belief, or in any situation, finding the most productive belief you can hold, and then exploring the situation through the lens of that productive belief. And again, you don't have to believe the belief you're holding, but just exploring the situation through that lens. As well as, if you want a bonus challenge, go out into the world and practice holding the belief and do some interactions from then, and then notice the differences you see.
Yeah. And if you have any trouble, just send us a message. Always happy to help.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you for watching. This is Ege.
This is Numer.
And this is the Data Driven Actualization podcast. See you guys next time.